Which is why, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the Windrush compensation scheme. Copies of the response to the consultation are available from the Vote Office. The United Kingdom has a proud history of welcoming arrivals from around the world. We have long held open a door to those who want to come and help build a better country, including my parents, for example, or indeed the parents of the Shadow Home Secretary. And we have all benefited as a result, with the UK emerging as a stronger, broader, more vibrant and successful nation. We would not be the country that we are today without the men and the women who crossed oceans to come here legally, to make their homes, to work hard, to pay taxes, to raise their families. And we all know it. Which is why the whole country was shocked by the unacceptable treatment experienced by some members of the Windrush generation. People who have built their lives in this country, people who have done so much for this country, people who have every right to be in this country, they were told that they were not welcome. It was a terrible mistake and it should never have happened. And that it did is a matter of profound regret to myself, to my department, to the government. That's why, just under a year ago, one of my first acts as Home Secretary was to stand at this dispatch box and to say sorry on behalf of successive governments. Sorry to the parents and the grandparents who suffered the trauma of being incorrectly ordered to leave the country they love. Sorry to those who had paid taxes here for decades only to be denied NHS care to which they were perfectly entitled. Sorry to hard-working men and women who were unfairly refused the right to work and even refused the dignity of a roof over their head. But I know that words alone are not enough, which is why, 11 months ago, I didn't just say sorry to members of the Windrush generation, I also vowed to right the wrongs that have been done to them. And I sincerely hope that this compensation scheme being unveiled today goes some way into doing that. It has taken longer than I would have liked, but if we are to deliver justice for the Windrush generation and their families, it is vital that we get this right. Today's scheme is the product of many months of work with affected individuals and their representatives, including well over 2,000 responses to our call for evidence and the consultation. We are also indebted to Martin Ford QC, who has provided us with invaluable independent advice and met with a great many of the individuals that were directly affected. His findings have contributed hugely to the final design of the scheme, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank Martin for his work. As a result of this meticulous approach, I am confident that the proposals for the scheme are closely aligned with what affected communities wanted to see. Namely, that it is simple, it is accessible, and above all, it is fair. Full information is now available online and via a free telephone hotline number. Guidance is being provided to help people understand what compensation they might be entitled to and how to submit a claim. And the application process itself is as simple and as clear as possible. It has also been important to note that the scheme is not only open to those of Caribbean origin. The government proposes broadly to align eligibility with the Commonwealth Citizens Task Force. This means that Commonwealth citizens settled in the UK before 1973, along with certain children and grandchildren of theirs, are eligible to apply if they have losses to claim for. Other eligible groups include those of any nationality who have a right of abode or settled status or are now British citizens who arrived to the UK to live in the UK before the 31st of December 1988. Of course, Mr. Speaker, the historical nature of the wrongs done mean that some of those who have been affected throughout the years are sadly not alive to see justice being done. Where this is the case, we propose to accept claims from the estates of individuals who would themselves have been eligible had they not passed away, and from close family members of an eligible person. But justice will not be done if people don't know about the scheme or, for any reason, they are afraid to engage with it. So in addition to today's media coverage, we will launch an extensive programme of events with key stakeholders, community groups and faith organisations so that people across the country and overseas know about the compensation that they can apply for. On the 22nd of June, we will be marking the second annual Windrush Day, a celebration of everything that the Windrush generation and their descendants have contributed to in the UK. And later this evening, I will be welcoming community group leaders to Parliament alongside some of those who have suffered and their families. It will be an opportunity to reflect not only on the mistakes of successive governments brought to this point, but also on what we as a country can do to ensure that mistakes like this are never repeated. Wendy Williams' review will explore how members of the Windrush generation came to be treated like illegal migrants, and I look forward to receiving her recommendations. But there is no doubt that the roots lie in a historical policy that saw people given settled status without also being given the ability to prove it. Nothing we say or do will ever wipe away the hurt, the trauma, the loss that should have never been suffered by the men and women of the Windrush generation. But together we can begin to wrong the rights of Windrush. We can right the wrongs of Windrush. We can begin to turn the page on this sad chapter in our history, and we can do justice by people who have contributed immeasurably to our country. When the UK called out for help, thousands of people from the Caribbean and across the Commonwealth stepped up to help get us back on our feet. Now it's time for us to step up and do what's right by those that we have failed. I commend this statement to the House.
Diane Abbott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Home Secretary for early sight of this statement, and I would also like to place on record our gratitude to Martin Ford QC and his colleagues for the advice he has provided. And I would like to say at this point that none of the delays in this process are attributable to him. We have to remember in this House how much pride the Windrush generation took in being British. We have to remember that they came here in good faith under passports which indicated to them that they were indeed British. And there are all the material challenges they faced as part of the Windrush scandal, but above all, having spoken to numbers of these people, there was the humiliation of being told year on year by the British state that somehow they were not British, they were not worthy, they were not deserving, and services they had paid into for years and years were not available to them. The reality is this is a scandal which should never have happened. It's a scandal where the government was initially slow to act, and it's a scandal where some members of Parliament deliberately muddied the waters with talk of illegal immigrants, when by definition none of the Windrush victims are here illegally. And it is a scandal which is set to continue unless and until the government ends its hostile environment. And it's a scandal which is set to multiply with the 3 million EU citizens because of the government's refusal to guarantee all their existing rights, and I'm sorry to say, the lack of preparedness at the Home Office. The Prime Minister previously told us she would fight burning injustices. Well, the Windrush scandal was a burning injustice, and it took place on her watch, first as Home Secretary and then as Prime Minister. Her successor as Home Secretary was obliged to relinquish her post because she incorrectly told this House there were no numerical deportation targets. We have since learned that the member for Hastings and Rye had written to the Prime Minister promising to increase deportations by 10%. We also know that deportation numbers were a key performance indicator when she presided over the Home Affairs, and that the Home Office officials received bonuses for the numbers of deportees. It is hard not to imagine that these targets, this performance indicator, these bonus didn't affect the lack of care with which the Windrush generation was treated. The current Home Secretary told this House in April of last year, "I will do whatever it takes to put it right." He also said, "We've made it clear that a Commonwealth citizen that has remained in the UK since 1973 will be eligible to get the legal status that they deserve, British citizenship." Yet here we are. We know that there are many citizens from the Commonwealth who've been here since 1973 who have still not been granted British citizenship and are not treated as British citizens still. On this side of the House, we welcome the fact that the compensation scheme will be open to the estate of deceased Windrush generation persons and also to their relatives. This was an ageing cohort, and it's only fair that their relatives should be able to claim. We also welcome the fact that the Home Secretary accepts that this is not just about persons from the Caribbean. The Windrush generation is so called because of that emblematic symbol of the Empire Windrush, but actually it involves anyone from a Commonwealth country that came to this country between 1948 and 1972. And I believe that there are many more persons that will need to come forward if we really are going to clear up this scandal. I would like to ask the Home Secretary, can he say a little about the Hardship Fund, which was set up in response to pressure from my honourable friends to deal with the immediate issues faced by the Windrush generation? How much is available to the Hardship Fund as a whole? And is it true that thus far only 2 people have had payments from the Hardship Fund? On the compensation scheme itself, we're glad to have further details, but I believe it still falls short of what is expected, what is required and what is fair. Is Home Secretary able to tell the House how much is available for the compensation scheme as a whole? Is the Home Secretary willing to comment on the fact that the scheme will not compensate those who may have gone back to the Caribbean or elsewhere in the Commonwealth for a holiday or a funeral and were refused to, they were not allowed to get back on the plane? And that the document says it is difficult to whether inability to return to the UK is a loss. Of course it's a loss. That's an extraordinary thing to say. We know that people were wrongly prevented from returning to their home here. The Home Secretary admits that. One of the reasons was that they were unable to provide documentary proof of their status. Now the Home Secretary proposes to exclude them from compensation. These are people who are British citizens, unable to return home, and in some cases separated from their families. This is not ending the scandal, it continues it. The Home Secretary and this government propose to make only a contribution to legal fees up to a fixed amount, but will not reimburse for fees higher than that amount. This is despite the fact that these legal costs are easily documented and were incurred in challenging wrongful loss of jobs, deprivation of public services, including the NHS, loss of home, wrongful detention and wrongful deportation. We note that there will be no compensation for private health care for persons living in this country who are unable to access the NHS care that they are entitled to. The remedies provided by the scheme include an apology and ex gratia payments. The government will make these compensation payments voluntary without necessarily establishing a formal legal obligation. Surely there must be a formal legal obligation. I don't think we can...
Can I just very gently say to the Shadow Home Secretary, this is going to be talked out as things stand, because we've only got till 1:45 and there are probably 20 colleagues wanting to take part. Diane Abbott.
I'm grateful to the Speaker. Let me say, finally, there are persons in this House, and some of them are the children of the Windrush generation. And whether we're on the front benches or the back benches, whether we're in opposition or in government, we will not rest until this generation, one of the bravest generations, gets the justice to which they are entitled.
Yeah. The Secretary of State for the Home Department, Sajid Javid.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, can I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments and also what she said about Martin Ford QC and the work that he has done to make this scheme a reality. And the Right Honourable Lady started by saying this should never have happened, and I absolutely agree with her and always have, and I think the whole House agrees with that. And of course, none of these people that were caught up were here illegally. They had every right to be here. She's referred to the compliant environment. It is is, I mean, sadly, when the Right Honourable Lady talks about this, she talks about it as though it's something that's an environment that's been put in place just since 2010. She knows that the rights to check on whether someone is here legally or illegally, it's something that there are a number of rules and regulations put in under the previous Labour government. And she talks about how people were affected. And again, it is worth reminding the House, because we are all trying to deal with this issue and provide justice. But it is worth reminding the House that when the historical review was done and it was determined that there were 164 people that were the most likely to have suffered detriment, almost half of those suffered that detriment under the previous Labour government. So it is just worth keeping in mind that successive governments have, in effect, caused this problem. And it is no good in this House just trying to point the finger at one particular government. The Right Honourable Lady talked about the EU settlement scheme, and it is precisely because of the lessons of Windrush we need a scheme that cannot be just declaratory in approach. We need to make sure that our EU's friends that are here in this country, that they are properly documented. That is the abiding lesson from Windrush, was the lack of proper documentation. And she's talked rightly about those who want to have UK citizenship, and she knows that we've set up a special route for that. Over approximately 4,000 people have taken advantage of that at no cost to themselves. She's right that it's not just open to the people of Caribbean origin, and I'm glad that we agree on that. She asked me about the Urgent Exceptional Payments Fund, which was not supposed to be another compensation scheme. It's supposed to be just that urgent exceptional payments. It's not capped, and 9 payments, I understand, have been made so far. She asked me about this particular scheme and how much it's likely to cost. There's no cap to this scheme, so no one knows what the eventual cost will be based on the needs and the claims that are actually made by eligible people. But the baseline estimate of my department is approximately £200 million. She referred to legal fees and also private healthcare costs, and I can tell in both of those cases, whilst there's a tariff structure, both of those actually allow for actuals being paid in certain circumstances where proof is provided.
Suella Braverman.
My parents came to the UK in the late 1960s from Mauritius and Kenya, Commonwealth countries, and they came with no one and with nothing except a desire to make their lives in Britain and to serve our country, like many of our parents in this room. I welcome, they could have been caught up in this episode as well, and I welcome the Home Secretary's commitment, his action and his statement today. Does he agree that this compensation scheme represents real progress towards securing justice for the Windrush generation, and with the independent Wendy Williams Lessons Learned review being the next vital step in the process?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend, and can I take this opportunity to thank her parents and the parents of millions of others for the contribution that they've made to this country. And I also agree with her about the importance of the work that Wendy Williams is doing. It will be a vital step to making sure that we right the wrongs.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Of course, it is imperative that the victims of the Windrush scandal are compensated justly for the outrageous and disgraceful way that they have been treated. If this scheme delivers some sort of justice, then it will be welcome, but we need more information before we can finalise our judgment on that. I welcome what the Home Secretary says in relation to there being no cap on the scheme, because it needs to be the needs of victims and not the choices of the Treasury that drive the total amounts of compensation that will be payable. But can the Home Secretary explain exactly what it is that the Home Office will be compensating? Is it only financial losses, or will it also be the devastating impact on health and well-being and family relationships and other aspects of life that so many have suffered? And can he tell us whether claiming compensation will preclude victims from seeking other forms of redress from the Home Office, including through the courts? And will those 9 people who have been able to claim from the Hardship Fund, will they also be able to claim thereafter from the compensation scheme as well? Mr. Speaker, it is welcome that the compensation scheme is not restricted to Caribbean countries, but why is the Department not undertaking work to proactively find victims of the scandal from all Commonwealth countries, rather than restricting case reviews only to the Caribbean countries? The Home Office has ruined the lives of citizens from all round the Commonwealth that should be proactively taking steps to fix and compensate in all of these cases. Finally, Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary referred to the shock that the whole country had felt in response to Windrush, but it should not have been a shock to the then Home Secretary and now the Prime Minister or her department, because it had been warned repeatedly that this was the inevitable consequence of the hostile environment. So we still need to know why the Home Office ignored even its own warnings and pressed ahead with the hostile environment regardless. So when will we see the Lessons Learned review published, and when will they start rolling back on the hostile environment policies like the right to rent?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments, and I can again reiterate there is no cap on this scheme for all the right reasons. And he asked me about is it just financial losses? It's not just financial losses. So if there's other detriment suffered, for example, where people wrongly detained, the scheme, that's one example, will allow for that. The honourable gentleman asked me about the urgent payment fund and whether those people will be eligible to apply under this scheme. Of course, absolutely, if they meet the eligibility criteria, and depending on the claim, there's no link in that way between the two schemes. And he's also pointed out that I think welcoming the fact that it's not limited to those that are just of Caribbean origin as Commonwealth citizens, but it's broader than that. And I think it's right that we have focused in the historical review on those that all the evidence has suggested are more likely to have suffered detriment, but it's also right that it's not just limited to Caribbean origin Commonwealth citizens. And also he's rightly pointed out the work of the Wendy Williams review, which is going to be vital to make sure we get everything right.
Traditionally slightly greater latitude for the chair of a select committee, but in view of the constraints of time, it would be appreciated if colleagues could confine themselves to single-sentence questions without preamble. Otherwise, lots of people will be prevented from speaking. Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent was unable to work for a considerable period of time, but that was then resolved thanks to the government taking action. But now he's struggling financially again because his wife is suffering from cancer. So how soon will he be able to claim? How easy is it to find the website? Because at the moment the links on gov.uk aren't completely clear to where to find the website. And how soon might he be able to get some money into his bank account to help him?
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to hear about the situation of my honourable friend's constituent. The claims can begin from today. The information has just gone up. We've also set up a free-phone helpline. There's going to be a number of people in the Home Office that will be dedicated to this, and we want to make the payments and process the claims as soon as possible.
Yvette Cooper.
The Home Office took 6 months to agree to the urgent hardship scheme, 9 months to set out the policy for it, and within 12 months of the Windrush scandal had still only helped 2 people out of the 48 that had applied, and I understand it is now up to 9, despite the fact that there were serious urgent cases needing help. Can he tell the House what he's going to do to make sure that we don't see the same kinds of delays with this compensation scheme, which we all welcome the support that people are going to need?
Mr. Speaker, it's very important that we get this scheme right, and that was why we wanted to make sure we consulted with as many people as possible, and that's why we had the call for evidence first. And also, indeed, when Martin Ford, the independent assessor of the scheme, when he asked for extra time so he could meet with more community leaders, more people that were affected, I believe that we have got it right now, and I'm absolutely committed to making sure that those eligible receive their compensation as quickly as possible.
Douglas Ross.
Statement and the work his department have done to enact this scheme. When he responded to the Home Affairs Select Committee report on this issue on the 24th of July, noting the end of the consultation on the 11th of October, he said he wanted this scheme to be implemented as quickly and as carefully after that as possible. Can he just explain the period between the consultation closing and this announcement? Because some people are concerned it's taken 6 months, but to get it right, it was right that we took that time.
It's been very important, Mr. Speaker, I can tell my honourable friend, to make sure, I think, over some 1,400 responses we had to the consultation, which are quite high for any consultation. We wanted to make sure that they were all looked at carefully, that we worked closely with Martin Ford and others, and that the systems were in place from day one for when the compensation scheme goes live. Now that it is live, I believe that we will be able to process claims quickly.
David Lemmy.
Will he undertake to publicise this scheme as widely as the EU settlement scheme? Will he ensure that there is no use of non-disclosure agreements as to how much somebody gets? And will he say if people with criminal convictions will still be entitled to using the scheme. Many people driven into poverty and therefore crime as a consequence of this scandal.
Mr. Speaker, we will absolutely be very widely publicising this scheme, and indeed the right honourable gentleman, I know he's very committed to providing justice for Windrush, for the Windrush generation, can help with his own Twitter feed and other ways, but he can absolutely help to make sure more and more people know about this scheme. He's asked me also, Mr. Speaker, about non-disclosure agreements. There will be no non-disclosure agreements under this scheme, and also he's asked me about those with the criminal convictions. They are entitled to apply under the scheme. It does say under the scheme if there are some individuals that apply that have serious convictions, the government reserves the right to change the amount of compensation not paid altogether, but generally no one is barred because of criminal convictions.
I heard the dignified evidence given to the Joint Human Rights Committee by some of the Windrush generation. I was astonished at the huge amount of documentation they provided and still being put into this position. What support is being given to those who are in the Windrush generation, or indeed anybody else who has all this evidence in front of them which is still dismissed?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to raise this, and I too remember cases that I've looked at myself personally where that kind of outcome should not have happened. In this particular case, with the compensation scheme, we have made it as simple and as straightforward as possible. That's why, for example, in some payments we have both a tariff structure and an actual structure, trying to provide as much choice as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I represent the Windrush Borough of Lambeth, and many of our residents have been directly affected by this. His officials have actually come down to help implement some of the measures his department have introduced, but I have to say to him, his processes have been anything but simple and accessible for people to use. What confidence can he give us that this scheme will be any different?
Mr. Speaker, we have looked at how this scheme is going to be implemented very carefully. So, for example, that's why today, along with the online information, there's much guidance on how applications can work and how to make them easier. There's also this free phone telephone number. There'll be dedicated staff in the Home Office working on this scheme. The scheme is going to be open for at least 2 years, and as it goes, I also make a commitment to look at if there are any issues, if improvements can be made, if some can be suggested by honourable members even, we will absolutely look at those.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Victims of the Windrush scandal need to be compensated for all of their losses. Can the Home Secretary give me the assurance that this will include any trauma that has also been experienced?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with the publication that we've made today, we set out carefully what type of the eligibility and what type of losses can be covered. And I believe that with the process of the consultation and with the support of Martin Ford, it's a very fair process.
Given the hostile environment was clearly one cause of the Windrush scandal, has the government accepted the recent High Court judgment against right-to-rent checks?
The right honourable gentleman may know that we are appealing that judgment.
Andrew Slaughter.
Will the Home Secretary look at the case of my constituent who has been refused an exceptional hardship payment, which she wanted to go and visit her 95-year-old mother with dementia and her father's grave in Grenada, and was told by his department to save up for it?
Secretary.
I'd be happy to take a look, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, will he extend a compensation scheme to highly skilled migrants wronged by the Home Office, and can he explain why those I've raised in the press have had their cases resolved and those who I have not raised in the press have not?
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the eligibility for the scheme is very wide. I set it out earlier in my statement, and that will most certainly include many people that are highly skilled migrants.
This publicity drive that the Home Secretary has talked about, will his officials be going through with their fingertips every case of other Commonwealth citizens who are caught up in this?
Secretary.
We want to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that no one is left out. We have, for reasons I've explained in the House before, focused on those of Caribbean origin, but that process of trying to find those that may have been wronged continues.
Emma Reynolds.
Will the compensation scheme cover the huge distress caused to those like my constituent Paulette Wilson, who was detained at Yarlswood and then the Heathrow Detention Centre and very, very nearly deported back to a country she hadn't been to since the age of 10?
Mr. Speaker, so one category we have also included in the compensation is discretionary category, because I was also well aware, whilst we can identify some of the most likely detriments to compensate, there may be some exceptional cases, and I wanted to make sure that nothing was left out by the compensation scheme.
Liz Kendall.
Will the Home Secretary look into the case of my constituent, Mr Espedy Alvester Thomas, who has once again applied for a passport, this time under the Windrush scheme? He still hasn't had a decision, and will he assure me he will take every action to make sure similar delays do not happen with this compensation scheme?
Mr. Speaker, I'd be happy to look into that case.
Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, will the Home Secretary publish a comprehensive breakdown of all of those wrongfully detained or deported by his department as a result of the hostile environment, on top of the Windrush victims? Mr.
Speaker, the honourable gentleman is well aware that very regularly we supply a letter to the Select Committee, and that contains much information on the scheme, and I'll take into account the suggestion he's made.
Joe Stevens.
There will be many victims of this tragedy who will be putting together very complex cases involving heads of loss across many areas. Will legal aid be available to those who need it?
Next question.
Mr. Speaker, we are looking carefully into what kind of support, if it's needed, because there will be some cases that are less complex. With the kind of case the Honourable Lady suggests, if they are complex, we want to make sure that people have help if they need to put those cases together, because we want to make sure that no one is denied justice and they can make a proper claim.
Point in the next. Jessica Morden.
Will the Secretary of State acknowledge that reassurances so far have not been enough for some people who are just too afraid to admit they have no status here? I know that from my constituency, and do more to reassure people to come forward.
Mr. Speaker, it's a very important point from the Honourable Lady, in that we want to make sure that everyone feels they can come forward first with the Windrush scheme itself in terms of documentation and passports and the work the task force is doing, but also to make claims for compensation. So, for example, I've also said in this scheme that no information that if anyone comes forward with the compensation scheme will be supplied to immigration enforcement and any other issues and concerns people might have.
Liz McInnes.
Fixed address or a bank account be required in order to claim compensation, given that some will have been denied access to these under the hostile environment?
I would think it would be certainly helpful if someone's got a bank account in terms of making compensation, but what we have set out to do is to make sure justice is done, do it in the fairest ways possible, and if there are exceptional circumstances for people in how you pay compensation, we of course will take that into account.
And Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Home Office fund independent legal advice for those Windrush citizens who may not be able to navigate the Home Office website system, or who may feel entirely unable to approach a department directly which has so comprehensively breached their trust?
Mr. Speaker, we have, as I mentioned a little earlier, tried to make this as simple as we can to navigate it with the guidance, with the free phone number. And if anyone finds themselves in that circumstance, I would suggest the first thing they do is call the free phone number.
66 of the emigrants carried on the HMT Empire Windrush were in fact Polish nationals, mostly relatives of those who'd fought for the Allies from El Alamein to Monte Cassino and beyond. Have they or their descendants been involved or consulted in any way during this process?
Mr. Speaker, I don't have a list of everyone who responded to the consultation. There were some 1,400, but I do know that it was wide-ranging and we had responses from many different nationalities.
Drew Hendry.
To the risk of a further Windrush, as hundreds of thousands of EU citizens applying for the rights risk missing the deadline, will he accept the cross-party calls to enshrine their rights in law to avoid this situation?
Mr. Speaker, it's precisely because we want to avoid another Windrush situation that it cannot be sufficient just to enshrine rights in law. What is needed with the EU settlement scheme is a proper process of documentation from day one.
Thank you. Order. Presentation of Bill. Joe Swinson.
Employment Rights, Shared Parental Leave and Flexible Working Bill.
Second reading.